highly versatile platform has adapted to fit the needs of hot rodders, drag racers, surfers, and even lowriders. These would all come together to create the Cal look and the Cal style. The Volkswagen Type 1, better known as the Bug, the Beetle, and the Slug Bug.
So on this episode of Influence Impact, we're going to be diving into the Volkswagen world, specifically the sedans, or what we call them, the bugs.
Correct.
So if you're with your kids and you want to play Slug Bug, good luck. It's definitely one of the most versatile of vehicles for customizing.
Definitely.
I mean, you see everything from kind of hot rod style, lowrider style, Euro import racing style, drag racing. I mean, all the way up to off-road.
I mean, they making them into trucks, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can...
motorhomes, all kinds of different stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
And we're going to be focusing primarily on the sedans, kind of the classic Bug Beetle. But we're going to be mentioning some of the siblings, if you will. You know, there's obviously the buses... the 23 windows, 21 windows. There were the trucks for a little bit. The Carmen Gias, which are kind of like the sporty versions.
Well, let me clear that up a little bit, because there are, like you said, most people think of a Volkswagen, they think of the word Beetle or Bug, and there are a couple different ones. But there's also even special years here. So let's go back to the start of this, because obviously we all know that where Volkswagens come from. Yeah,
well, and obviously came from Germany, first imported here in the late 40s.
Yeah, 1949 is the first year of a United States car.
Yeah, and it didn't really obviously get a lot of popularity because not a lot of great German sentiment after World War II.
Yeah, it kind of took a little while.
And if you want to know like the true history or the foundation of Volkswagen,
yes,
go online, look at Wikipedia. I'm sure they got plenty of information, plenty of History Channel documentaries on all of that stuff.
Yes,
but
totally.
we're going to be focusing on the Cal style, Cal look. And there's a difference.
Right.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, let's break down some of the years, because there's some years we're talking about like the oval window, the split window, the kind of the differences that come into play a lot later on.
Right. So our 49 to say 54 are split windows.
Okay.
Which basically just means the rear window is two pieces. It has a spine in the back.
And fairly just flat glass, just a little bit rounded on the edge just to follow the contours.
Right. Which were horrible to look out of.
Yeah, you got a big old blind spot right in the middle.
Exactly. So by 55, they knew they had to open up that back window, and that's when they created the oval window.
Yeah.
And that's usually like when people say like, oh, Volkswagen, I'd love to have one. I'd love to have an oval window. That's what mostly you're referring to is the 55 to 57, which I think is really funny because it's the same years as like a Tri-5 Chevy.
Yeah.
Right. Like
that was kind of like the I guess you could say the good years, or the really explosive years of automotive design and automotive, kind of culture in the U.S.
Right. And those years too, they had some other distinct things that people, also look for in bugs. They had a retractable sunroof that they called a ragtop because it was made out of canvas. And they also had semi-4s, which would actually be like little levers that would light out for
some of the
turn
coolest
signals.
turn signals.
Totally cool things like that.
They had big fenders. You could have easily popped some turn signals on the back, but those kind of Frenched in, semaphore turn signals were pretty cool. But actually, some people later on would actually get rid of those.
Get rid of those. I know.
They would shave them and get rid of them. Whereas, now you would think like that you got to try to save.
Well, but even the oval windows were hard to drive. So by 58, they knew they had to open up the back window to like more of a square window. So that's your 58's your first year of what most people see on the road. Like they see the Bug window.
I was going to say that
back window.
Just your fairly standard window.
Right.
So definitely the oval window, only a couple years, is kind of the most
sought after
one.
Split windows are unicorns. Really difficult to find.
Yeah.
Most
those are the
people
early
that are
ones.
Yeah, and most of the collectors of these cars, they already have them. You're not going to find
and they're not getting rid of them.
Yeah. You're not just going to come across a split window on offer up.
Well, and obviously 49 was the first year they importing into the U.S. being available. But I do know that people would import them.
Oh yeah.
Because we even have some friends like Gary Bell's, his Volkswagen that's been 100-point restored.
Right.
Has a British or German tag, I think, the number on it, and right-hand drive.
Yeah.
And so there were some that were imported over, but being, publicly available to anybody was at that time.
Yeah.
And I know, you start getting into the 60s and the 70s.
And they kind of, yes, there's a split. Like 64 was the last year of the small side windows, Where 65s, they got bigger like side windows for your backseat passengers.
Yeah.
But really, for the most part, the 60s are all kind of the same until we get to 67. And 67 is kind of known in the Volkswagen world as that pinnacle, like the best one
the
made.
tipping point or
right.
the turning point
because
for something.
What happened was 68, the U.S. had a bunch of regulations that came out for safety.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to have the larger bumpers, the high back seats, kind of a lot of seat belts came into play now. So most of the bug purists, they're like, if it's a 68 and later, who really cares?
Yeah.
So
or maybe you could, if you had a 68 or later, you could swap the bumper to an earlier bumper or do something similar.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of guys would do. Once again, going back to the versatility.
Yeah.
Right. But 67, if you're looking for
that golden
that's
year.
the golden year. Yeah.
Where it's still cooler, older styling,
right.
but modern, 12 volt.
And I'm guilty as charged. I had a 67 for 6 years that I drove daily.
Yeah.
And when I say I drove it, I mean I drove it to Texas. I drove it to Oregon. I drove it to Ensenada. Like I drove it everywhere.
And that's the thing. I mean, these were fairly simple cars where the engine, they're small engines. I mean, we're going by cc's, not cubic inches, basically.
Right.
And
well,
they're fairly simpler. I mean,
I'll throw out some horsepower numbers. Yeah. I mean, your average 1600, which would be at the time, even in 1968, is when you get a 1600, made 36 horsepower.
Not 136,
right? So guys
36.
But guys did. I mean, look, the pioneers of those guys. Obviously, everyone's going to hot rod something.
Yeah.
So that 36 horsepower doubled very quickly. By the time guys figured
and that's
out
the thing. There's. Because they are fairly simple, where it's like, okay, let's just bigger carburetor on there, better, exhaust system.
Yeah.
It's fairly simple to kind of, ramp those up and get a lot more power. And they weigh 2,300 pounds
if
maybe
that.
or something,
yeah.
2,000 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, they were super light cars, built extremely strong too. I mean, if you start looking at the radiuses of how the sedans are put together, the strength of just what it is, I mean, it's very difficult to crush a roof on a VW. Just based on how it's built. Yeah. So they were strong and sturdy cars, and that's why people use them for everything. I mean, we'll get into the desert stuff that they used to do with them.
We'll do that later.
Right? I mean, later on. But
where, especially too, it was, essentially kind of became a platform to put whatever you wanted on it or do whatever you wanted with it, because it's almost like a skateboard, basically, where it's, you got the belly pan, the tub, you got the engine in the back that I think people could say it's 2 bolts and you could take the whole
4 bolts
and you could take the entire engine out in your lap.
Yep.
Basically.
Yeah.
And carry it out. So,
right. But let's also back up to this though, because at first they were the cute little German car.
That's a lot of people might associate, especially the buses, like the hippie era, the Woodstock, in the 60s, going out to, caravan basically, and you'd take the bus and sleep in it and all that stuff. So a lot of the hippie stuff got associated with it.
Not only that,
the bugs probably a little bit more.
Well, I look at the Tesla Cybertruck right now as being the Volkswagen of the time. Because back then, you got to remember that,
and it looks completely different.
It looked completely different than anything
car
on the road. It looked completely different than even my grandfather used to call them foreign cars. Right? Like, oh, look at that foreign car over there.
Yeah.
Right? Well, they look different. They didn't look like Fiats. They didn't look like Italian cars. They didn't look like, a Jaguar. They were unique. And so on the road, they looked really unique. So at first it was like kind of the cute, look at that cute little novelty car driving around. And honestly, they didn't make horsepower. They didn't really corner very good. So they weren't performance driven.
And that's the thing. You're talking about the 50s. The freeways were starting to be implemented, whereas these were, Germany, you have larger freeways and the Autobahn and stuff like that, but you got to think Europe is very geared towards a small compact car getting around small streets.
Right.
You don't need a ton of horsepower.
No.
But kind of people in America at that time this was the era of the muscle cars. This was the era of large cars and large sedans. So the small Volkswagen was a novelty.
But at the same time too, there was a guy named Ferdinand Porsche that worked at a place called Volkswagen and was pumping out these little cars called 356s that all of a sudden they figured out, wow, that same Volkswagen platform with a bigger motor goes pretty fast.
Oh, you mean a hot rod?
Yeah.
That's basically a hot rod.
And the other thing too is Porsches were cheap back then. I mean, it was something
it wasn't the Wall Street sports car.
So there were people that were buying 356s and they might have wrecked them, and all of a sudden now there's a Porsche engine that bolts into a sedan that's available in the wrecking yard. So
and the same thing with the wheels. You could
all of a sudden that fits on there, right?
It's the same exact formula
Right.
of hot rodders, of customizers rolled around. It's take the cheap, accessible
Right.
version of a car,
Yeah.
find the luxury or performance, items meant for a larger car or
Right.
a more expensive car, and transplant those parts onto it.
Right.
So that's what you started definitely seeing a lot of the guys in the 60s or
Right.
later on start doing with these bugs.
Exactly. And so the guys that were doing that in the early days, they of course wanted to contest their speed.
Well, we're talking muscle car era, drag racing era,
big, right?
So obviously, they're going to be going, and that's what he's saying. If you're replacing or redoing an engine that has 36 horsepower,
Right.
why are you only going to go to 55 horsepower?
Exactly.
You're going to go.
Right. Let's see
as
how far
big
we
as
can
you
take
can-
this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
You're going to
yeah.
see how long you can go.
So what a lot of those early guys did, they try to go to like NHRA events. They try to go to different, sponsored, let's say V8 events, and they were not welcome.
And that's NHRA tracks. I mean, I think they were mostly all looking at American cars, like it had,
Exactly.
and they had probably a lot of American sponsorships and
And
stuff
well,
too. I mean,
and also too at the time, it still just wasn't really.
it had to be its own class,
Yes.
for sure, because you're not
Yes.
going to compete against.
Well, how are you going to race it? Yeah.
Yeah.
How are you going to race against some muscle car that's got twice the horsepower and,
Yeah.
and be competitive? So they were looking for that class, and NHRA was not there. So it's kind of funny. Around, I think it's like mid 60s, maybe 65, 66.
65, yeah.
You got Der Kleiner Panzers, which is kind of the first official Volkswagen club. Those guys were the guys that said, look, we're going to have to band together and try to create our own events.
And that's, create your, if the hot rod guys don't accept us, we'll do it ourselves.
Exactly.
And
So the DKP guys, I want to say around maybe the later 60s. It took them a few years to get their own event because Orange County International Raceway was opened. So down here in Irvine, which now is basically
The Great
Holmes.
Park.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's called the
it's
Great
the
Park
Great Park
now.
Irvine, yeah.
But that was actually an airfield that had runways that they used that for drag racing.
Well, because that was near, if you want to look up to like the El Toro Marine Base down there, so that's where there was open land in the military bases. So
Yeah.
But in 1968 they hosted the first bug-in.
That's right.
And that was kind of one of the premier Volkswagen events for
became
probably
that, yes.
30 years.
Yes. I believe before the original guy, I mean, when DKP guys were still doing it, I want to say they did 31 of them because it lasted until about I want to say 81, 82. Is when because obviously Orange County International Raceway also closed down.
Yeah, so they needed a place to actually do it at.
Right.
But so they hosted that at the Orange County Raceway down in Irvine. And it included drag racing, but as well as just kind of car shows and,
And that was the other
kind of a little bit of everything, just all Volkswagen, bug related.
And that's how they did it. It went back to, like you said, the car was so versatile. There were so many different people doing different things to them, but the DKP guys, and that's a tongue twister.
Well, I was saying it's probably more of a tongue twister saying Der Kleiner Panzer.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, right. So, I mean,
I'm only saying it because I can read it right here.
Yeah. And those guys, they were obviously after the drag racing part of it, but no, it was also, hey, what are we customizing these cars with and accessorizing these cars?
Yeah.
Because having a place to do it, now you're going to have people fall in line, and they certainly did. There's actually Econo Motors was the first one that I can think of that they owned a Volkswagen dealership actually out in Riverside, California.
Yeah.
And they saw the writing on the wall of like, hey, we need to start, kind of customizing some of these parts or bringing parts to the marketplace so people can customize these cars. So EMPI, which stands for Engineered Motor Parts International.
There's another tongue twister, but EMPI is kind of what everybody knows. And,
right.
They're still around today.
They're still around. They're down the street from my house.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty amazing story though, because they started the revolution.
Well, and they started that company in 1968. So we'd probably have to look a little bit more maybe to see the dates of it, but chances are they went to that bug-in.
I'm sure, yeah.
As a Volkswagen dealership,
right.
Saw the writing on the wall and saw that, hey, there's a good market for aftermarket or custom, parts available for these guys. And at that point too, 1968, the first ones were being imported in 1949. So we're talking 20-year-old Volkswagen cars at that point are maybe what people are working on. So there's a need for a parts manufacturer or a parts distributor company beyond just the dealership.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So, but and they had their own kind of signature stuff, like they had like some 5-spoke and 8-spoke design wheels versus just the smoothie steel wheels kind of that were on a lot of the the Volkswagen. So, definitely a little bit more minded towards the performance end of it.
Right.
Versus the styling. But yeah, and we also kind of get a little bit mixed in with, like we mentioned, the buses, the Carmagias, the fastbacks, the squarebacks,
yep.
all that kind of stuff. So what were kind of the, because I know we called them Beetles and Bugs, but
right.
Germany had different terms for all these different types of cars and these models.
Correct. So real quick, if it's a sedan, basically a Beetle or a Bug, it's called a Type 1.
Yeah.
Okay. If it's a bus or a transporter, so not just the bus or a 21 window, but the ones that look like trucks.
Yeah, the truck kind of.
Those are Type 2s. If it's a squareback, fastback, and sometimes a Ghia, it's a Type 3. Mm-hmm. And then Ghias are completely all themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Kind of. Yeah.
And the reason for the Ghia being totally themselves, because yes, they do make a Type 3 Ghia, and they also make a notchback that would be also a Type 3. That's kind of like that funny looking.
Yeah.
Looks
very
like
similar, but yeah.
Is it going frontwards or backwards? Right. But
I mean, that's most Bugs or
which way are you
they're
going?
very symmetrical.
Correct.
So if you're still rocking your stock stereo system, you need some help, and you need to go to Powerbase and check out their OEM direct fit line of speakers. Basically, a plug and play operation on any newer Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Nissan, you name it. And I actually got a full set in my Toyota 4Runner. It sounds amazing, especially considering you're basically just replacing the factory speakers. So go check them out at powerbaseusa.com. Use the code AUTOREV24 and you can get 10% off anything on the site, including these cool little Bluetooth speakers. This one right here is the Sound Cube. Clip it on your backpack, take it down to the beach. And what's really cool is this split speaker. So you can put one in the kitchen, one in the backyard at a party. Everyone's having a good time listening to the same music. Basically got like full stereo, almost surround sound system in this little package. So if you use the code AUTOREV24, you can get 10% off. So go check them out and take a listen. So you've been following along on Auto Revolution, you know that we're a big fan of Chevy OBS trucks. And Beltec Suspension has been around for 40 years, and they were one of the first innovators of the sport truck movement back in the 80s. And we've been lucky with them to partner on a few different projects, from the OBS Clash documentary series to the Tahoe Unlimited, and even a few things we've got up our sleeves coming out later this year. What's really cool is they've partnered with us to offer free shipping if you use the code AUTOREVOLUTION24 at beltec.com. So whether it's a lowering kit on your Chevy or a lift kit on your Bronco or your Jeep, and if you use the code AUTOREVOLUTION24 at beltec.com, you're going to get free shipping. Now back to the show. Yeah,
that was supposed to be the Volkswagen
a sports car. You know, if you're your two-seater,
low sedan, low center of gravity. Yeah. They handle pretty good. That kind of thing.
And that's, we started seeing, those being customized a little bit later, but, if you go from the drag racing era, if you will, of the Volkswagens in the late 60s into the 70s, I think very similar too in the hot rodding world or the customizing world, you started to see kind of a little bit of a split, or you'd go from your drag racing performance only hot rod guys to your show car kind of guys.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
a lot, I think, kind of started to have that performance influence, but not, these were nice cars, not being just straight drag race.
Well, like you said, by the early 70s, we've already got 20 years of Volkswagens.
Yeah.
So now you've got people that can afford to customize them in different ways because they can afford the car.
Pick up an older one.
Yeah, pick up an older one, right? So yeah, you had the guys that were the strict drag race kind of team, and if you look at those guys, they were going after speed. So they would remove the bumpers, and they'd put like what they called T-bar bumpers that were just aluminum little bumpers, and the reason for them was it was to push the cars. So if you needed to push the car to start it, obviously you'd use another car, right? It's kind of like from your sprint car days.
No, I mean, it's you would see all the same things on a hot rod, you know, going out to the dry lakes. You'd see those same type of bumpers on those because, you would need to run it, the shop truck behind it to push it to start. And the funny thing, though, is I know, and I know, too, that you can
push start a bug by yourself.
You can push start a bug or walk start a bug by yourself.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And
but it's the style. I mean, that's like,
no, and that's
they're
what
mimicking what's on the drag strip. So it makes sense.
And that's what, obviously if they're going to the drag strips and they're seeing the hot rod guys or something like that, they're going to be borrowing some of it because also too, a lot of from hot rodding to obviously these Volkswagens, a lot of the style came from functionality.
Right.
So obviously you mentioned getting rid of bumpers that are heavier.
Right.
Getting rid of some of the trim, kind of lightening the weight of all of it.
Right.
Maybe throwing some louvers on the rear, trunk for cooling, better cool, because these are all air cooled.
That's correct.
Engines as well.
Right.
It wasn't until like the Porsche era in the
late
80s.
Late 90s.
Late 90s when
late
they
90s.
went to water cool.
Yes. We still had a Porsche 99 or a 996, I think, until like 97. Yeah. It's crazy.
So anything Volkswagen Bug is always going to be air cooled.
Right.
If you're putting some louvers on the back, it's just going to be better cooling, better performance for you, basically.
Right. There was Impy actually came out with what they called standoffs, which were a little bracket that would just kind of take the place of the upper part of what they called the bonnet. Right. It's not the hood.
It's European. Yeah.
Right. So, and that would stand off the deck lid. Would stand off the back of the car, so it would catch air and go directly into the engine
just
compartment.
Another little air scoop, kind of, if you will.
Right. Yeah. So, and even too, some guys, and let's get more into the show stuff, because the drag racers were doing their thing. And it's more of kind of like what makes it go faster.
Yeah.
But then the show guys came in and they took some of that look, but then they refined it and made it more of a street car.
Yeah. Now and that is essentially what was then termed the Cal look.
Perfect. Yes. Yep. Yes, and we're talking what year too?
So that, and we actually, unlike some of other terminology or years and stuff, we can kind of pinpoint that at least terminology, and that was from the magazine world.
Yes.
From hot VWs, which it's actually dune buggies and hot VWs.
That's correct.
But obviously they kind of saw the direction that they were going, and hot VWs was the main thing. But yeah, 1975, there was a bug on the cover. That got termed the California look.
Yep.
And it's, you got your T-bar, front bumper, you've got obviously
it's a BRM,
the rag on that. Yeah. You got some BRM mag wheels.
Yeah. 1700 that's built by Fat Performance, which they were the place to go in that term or that time frame.
Yeah. For
in Orange County
engines.
That's where you would take it to Fat Performance. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, so that's what termed the Cal look or the California look.
Right.
So let's kind of expand a little on that.
Yeah.
Because that's going to then play in later to kind of a different styling that came about from kind of the same era and the same location, but a little bit more north of Orange County.
Yeah.
But with the Cal look, obviously the monochromatic paint.
Yeah.
Some of the drag racers were putting graphics or doing lettering on the side for the name of the car,
right.
and some of the guys borrowed that, but for the most part it was monochromatic paint job.
Yeah.
Very similar to the hot rods of the era.
Right.
Wouldn't do two tones.
No.
Which I kind of thought was interesting because to me a Volkswagen Bug lends itself to a two-tone very well.
It does. And I've had 2 or 3 of them that were two-tone. But at that time, no. At that time, the Porsche look had a lot to do with that. Because 911s were coming out, and the 912s were the ones that had chrome rings around the headlights. 911s came out, they painted them. So that was kind of the first coin, hey, make it look more like a Porsche.
Yeah, more sleek, more, and that's, like you said, trying to make the cheaper car look more performance or more stylized.
Yeah.
So obviously you mentioned, dechroming a lot of them.
They'd shave the taillight, because the taillights on those cars, especially if you had a 60s car, you had the taillight on the top of the fender. I'm sorry, I say taillight, but I mean to say turn signal. You'd have the front turn signals on the top.
This is after the semaphore,
right?
Flip out.
And the cool ones, the other ones that were cool, they had the bullet ones that are low on the fenders, and those were from the 50s. But the 60s turn signals on the top of the fenders were hideously ugly.
Yeah, so get rid of those.
Yeah. Some guys went ahead and got rid of door handles, but really, when the Cal look first came out, it was still just about keeping functionality of the car.
Yeah.
But just getting rid of the extras.
Yeah, getting rid of the stuff that sticks out or stands out, or from the drag race world, what would maybe give you a little bit of resistance.
One of the big things that I would always notice as a kid growing up that to me said Cal look was one-piece side glass windows, where you would actually remove the vent window and they would replace it with a one-piece set of glass.
Solid side
and it was
window.
the roll-down window that you'd have in the door.
Yeah.
But to me, it made the car look totally different because it took away that interruption you had in the window, and it made the front window almost match the back window. So again, very symmetrical.
Well, no, and that's, you look at Volkswagens and look at the front.
Yeah.
Obviously most cars are all symmetrical, looking at the front or the back, but look at a side view.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother story, but you look at a side view of a Bug and it's pretty much almost the same.
Right.
So that just helped lend it to it. And it's the same thing going back to the Boyd look or the hot rod look, where it's anything that interrupted your eye when you looked through it.
Yep.
Get rid of it.
Right.
And that's same thing. They would take off the fancier, window trim, with the chrome,
and replace it with the standard trim.
Just go straight, black rubber gasket.
Yeah.
You mentioned the one-piece windows. We talked about, some louvers and stuff like that.
Right.
Let's get into some of the wheel selections are pretty specific. And a lot of them would come from obviously takeoffs from Porsches.
Right.
Because they would fit, and you got some Porsche wheels on there.
Well, they wouldn't
Oh, they
fit,
wouldn't. Okay.
Right?
I figured they would be this, because they're so popular.
So Volkswagens up until, again, 1968 was the big change. So up until 68, Volkswagens were always a wide 5. Which was a Porsche pattern.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Porsche changed all that with the 911, and they made a smaller 5 pattern.
Okay.
Okay. So your Fuchs wheels.
Yeah. The ones that are the popular ones and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
The ones that we refer to as Porsche alloys. They have a smaller pattern, so you'd have to run an adapter. The good thing is that aircraft people were around this area.
Yeah.
So anything could have been machined or built very quickly, and that's why adapters came out. But Impy though, with their 5 spokes and also their now this was funny too. Impy's 5 spokes fit on 5 lug wheels. Impy 8 spokes fit on 4 lug wheels.
Yeah.
So that was kind of your way of letting you know, kind of also too, what your car you have just by it going down the road.
Yeah.
Right. But also too, at the time, people didn't want to change over from 4 lug to 5 lug or back and forth just for a set of wheels.
Yeah. The adapters were something probably could easily get around and throw on there, but going that crazy maybe wasn't in the cards, but you had your Porsche 901s. I was even looking at I looked up Porsche Riviera 914 wheels.
Yes, which again too were 4 lugs, so they bolted directly on the car.
Okay, so those ones were
so that one was kind of that was easier for people to get, but at the same time too, like a Porsche 914 was still a car in the 80s, like it's still like you saw it on the road. So Rivieras were expensive.
Yeah,
it wasn't just something that you're going to just find in the recycler paper. Right. So that was difficult, but
those are maybe a little more sought after or harder to
they totally
get
were.
Across. Yeah.
But you had basically people back in these days, you would either chrome the factory wheel and run like what would people call a baby moon cap, which baby moon's a terminology that comes from the hot rodding world. It doesn't come from Volkswagen.
From Dean Moon.
Right, exactly.
Moon eyes.
But it just, those caps had like a moon shape that would have your
basic
nice Volkswagen logo in the middle of it. You had your Impys with obviously, of course, your 5 spokes, 8 spokes. BRM, which was actually a wheel company from England that would do stuff for MGs and different, like the minis
European
and stuff
sports
like that.
cars.
European sports cars. So you had BRMs. Porsche wheels, you had obviously your Fuchs wheels, which are alloys. Cookie cutters, which came on 944s.
Yeah.
928 wheels, which were called phone dials because they had kind of that weird...
like a rotary kind of...
Like a rotary phone. Yeah. So they had phone dials. Riviera, as you mentioned, off the 914. So a lot of stuff, a lot of cool wheels.
Well, what's interesting is kind of around the same time as the Cal look was becoming established and becoming very popular, that was still a lot in Orange County area. Like we talked about the Bug-In being held at Orange County Raceway in Irvine. Right. You go a little bit northwest and west, if you will. I mean, depending on what area you're in, there was kind of a little bit different style of Volkswagen Bugs that were being built that became termed as Cal style.
Right.
So you had the Cal look in Orange County, and in LA County you had the Cal style.
Right.
But that term wouldn't really take hold until later on, and it just was essentially needed to establish kind of your difference between the two. I want to keep saying styles and looks. Yeah. But right now, those are not interchangeable necessarily.
Right.
So talking about 1975, that was when, Hot VWs kind of coined the term Cal look.
Right.
At that same time, you had a couple guys, a couple brothers out in La Puente, Eddie Boy Chacon.
Okay.
I think I said that correctly.
I think you're pretty close.
And his brother Adam.
Yeah.
They kind of came from the lowrider world a little bit. That's what they grew up around.
Right.
Obviously seeing the cruising going on in East LA and in that era. And so they started customizing a Volkswagen Bug themselves that a lot of the magazines first kind of started calling it either Chicano style.
Right.
Being from
where
LA,
it was at. Right. Yeah.
Or vintage style or even Resto Cal. But they didn't really like that terminology for it,
right?
Just because we're
It's
just
sounds
like
second. Yeah.
No, it's just, it was resto style.
Right.
Like, no, we're customizing these.
Yeah.
This is custom. It's not, but they were keeping a lot of the factory trim.
Right.
Kind of borrowing a lot from the lowrider bombs, of the late 40s, where you kind of had every dealer accessory, every chrome piece, or, maybe you had the base model car, but you wanted all the trim level of the deluxe or something higher end,
right?
But they were still slamming them on the ground, lowering them. A lot of them would kind of borrow the same things from the Orange County guys of putting those Porsche alloy wheels on them,
right?
But that's really where you started to see some of the distinctions kind of start to come, where you had the Orange County Cal look guys stripping stuff down, removing bumpers, and then you had, even within some of the rules of the Volkswagen club that these guys started, called the Bugs Buddies,
right?
Where you had to have factory color, had to have all your factory bumpers,
right.
your some of your factory trim, but they would just still slam it on the ground.
First off, I want to say this, because at the time when I built cars like these, like, I was into the Cal look. I was after the drag race type thing.
Yeah.
However, I'm going to say these guys saved Volkswagens, because they saved all the heritage of what they were before the drag racer guys got to them.
Yeah, the drag racer guys were throwing out parts.
Yeah, exactly.
These guys were keeping them.
They were keeping them. And honestly, they kept a lot of very extremely rare items that...
That's true.
You got to think that the hanging air conditioner on a Chevy, they made one for a Volkswagen, but guess what? There wasn't too many Volkswagens. Yeah. So that air conditioner that fits a bug,
thing,
that thing's worth 3 times the amount that it is for a Chevy.
Yep.
So that kind of stuff. Roof racks, those got really popular. All of a sudden, if you didn't have a rag top, you had to have a roof top or a roof rack, because those were cool. And those guys found those things in, old areas. It wasn't like there was still a Volkswagen, accessory store open that said, oh, we still have those. No, that was found somewhere. That was in someone's backyard or a wrecking yard somewhere.
And that's, a lot of the influence, like you mentioned, came from the lowrider world.
Right.
And the bombs, where it was, you were trying to keep everything. But, some of those guys would take it a step further and do the performance engine in there. And I think a lot of that maybe is because, like you said, how many horsepower was it?
Yeah, 36 horsepower. Even back in the 80s, getting onto an LA freeway was a chore.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was like a little bit like you'd kind of look back, like, is that truck going to kill me? Maybe I'll just wait in the emergency lane for a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. So being able to have enough horsepower to get on the freeway,
that alone
made a lot.
So probably a lot of the performance side wasn't necessarily
necessity.
Hot rodding. It was more necessity for the time period of the late 70s and into the early 80s.
And the hard thing about that too is it kind of was a perfect storm, because really horsepower didn't come in Volkswagens until 68. Again, dual port cylinder heads. They couldn't make that much power with the single port cylinder heads because there just wasn't enough room.
Yeah.
So when they came out with dual port cylinder heads, that was a game changer. That helped these guys make those things go from 36 to 60 horsepower to 90 horsepower to 110 horsepower.
I was gonna say, do we know what? Maybe we should look up what.
Well, I mean, it's
like the most horsepower.
You
could turbo. You could put turbos on it. You could do
a good street. Okay, here's a couple good street car numbers, because you mentioned before everything was dealt in cc's, not cubic inches. Okay, so your normal Volkswagen, let's pick a 65, because a 65 would have been a 1300 cc single port engine. Most guys would take that engine out, they would bore the case, and they would either go to a 1641 with a dual port head. They would go to a 1776 dual port head or an 1835. Those are your like street motors.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you're driving an 1835, you're making 130 horsepower on a 2,000 pound car, and you're handing that 68 Camaro big block. You're handing him.
No, because that's the Camaro's got the torque and way more power, but it's a lot more weight.
Power to weight.
Yeah, power to weight ratio.
An 1835 will carry the front wheels through an intersection of a car. You can
I was
mess
gonna
with
say it
Porsches.
probably could because you got to remember where the engine's located on one of those. Yeah.
So the problem with that is that the engines got big, the engines got fast, the rest of the car didn't. So brakes were sketchy as hell.
Yeah.
Right. Driving the car, sketchy as hell. So, yeah, there was some give and take there. But again, too, with anybody that's going to tinker with the car, you make upgrades.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that's, to me, I think, obviously kind of like we're talking about the Volkswagen Bug stuff. A lot of it started with drag racing or that kind of style, but it definitely lent more to the cruiser, street cruiser, kind of show car style. Cause you started to get your high end, show cars, and just quickly back to that lowrider, kind of style in the early 80s. That style really started to kind of almost take over a lot of it.
I think it did, because the drag racers were drag racers.
Yeah.
So you went to go see cars, you went to a drag strip, and that's not everybody's cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
Around Southern California at the time, we had RG Canning.
And you had cruise nights.
Hollywood Boulevard.
Hollywood, Whittier.
Yeah,
a lot of those were in the LA area too.
Yeah, it was Mecca.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, for that kind of vehicle, because again, they were young people that were driving around cheap cars that had enough money to fix them up themselves. That was the other thing I missed too, is that most of the time you'd see a home built car.
Yeah.
You didn't have a lot of professional. There weren't Rod Emery was still a kid, right? So you didn't have like these high-end chip foose builders that were building the cars. No, it was like, hey, this guy built this out of his garage with his buddies.
There were a handful of kind of smaller shops.
Right.
We did mention, the MPs. There's also like, vintage VW parts.
Oh yeah.
There, Johnny Speed and Chrome was a big one.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of them were just kind of your home built stuff. And actually, like, we talked about the lowrider guys. Duke's Car Club,
right,
had a huge influence on the Volkswagen scene,
right,
which you may not think about.
I know,
being that they're one of the oldest lowrider clubs,
right. You think of Bombs, or you
California,
think of, yeah,
and they're definitely geared towards that, as opposed to like your 6.4 Impalas, hoppers, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But in 1980, there's a guy named Rene Roulis, who had his 67 Ghia,
right,
and it was slammed,
nice car,
on smoothies, and then he ended up putting some polished Porsche alloy wheels on it,
right,
because they were after the chrome,
yep,
they were after that flash,
yeah,
whereas the cow look guys were mag style,
right,
or just factory kind of bolting it on.
Yeah.
So like that polish and that show stuff really came from the lowrider world, that kind of even further got put into it with one of the sons of one of the founders of the Duke's Car Club named Jaime Lopez.
Okay.
Where he had a Volkswagen Bug that had Porsche wheels on it. It was slammed. It was a convertible.
Yeah.
But it had chrome gravel guards on it.
The stuff that drag racer guys would take off.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
It had like the chrome, vent shades. It had, the chrome headlight covers, like all
the little eyebrows,
all the chrome accessories you could think of.
The louver shade in the back window.
Well, and that's obviously this one was a convertible, but that was very popular too, to put the Venetian blinds in the back, and that came from the lowrider bomb world.
Yeah.
So the Cal style was definitely accessorizing, whereas the Cal look was de-accessorizing, if you will.
Totally, 100% correct. Well, what was funny is both of those styles, they would share wheels, but you could tell a Cal style guy from a Cal look guy, because the Cal look guy would leave like the center painted black.
Yeah.
Right? Well, like how a factory Porsche wheel would be. But then, no, the Cal style guys you had to polish it, which I actually kind of like the...
No, I think that looks good too and stuff as well. And we started to see that blend over into like the mini truck world.
Yeah.
Obviously we covered that in one of our episodes. You can go check that out. Where you would put the Porsche alloys on it, but they'd be polished.
Right.
And you'd have the chrome fender trim, but like on a Mazda.
Right.
Or something like that.
Right.
So, and that was your LA style versus your Orange County style. So the styles were not just Bug, applied, but they really kind of took their own in this world.
Right.
So,
and we talk a lot about, we're mentioning the California style, the Cal, look, that kind of stuff. Yes, a lot of it was California, because not just, we're talking Southern California scene, we're talking LA and Orange County, but even too, like Sacramento had a humongous Bug following. But a lot of it, they took cues from what was going on down here, because those were the parts that were available. Yeah. So you kind of sometimes you see a Sacramento guy that would come down, or you might even see maybe a Fresno guy come down. I mean, CB Performance is a pretty big place out in Fresno. They were an early place. But even some of the shops, let's talk about some of the shops, because you could also tell where you were from by what sticker you had on your car.
Well, and that's, they were fairly local shops still,
right.
And local parts companies.
You brought up Johnny Speed and Chrome. Mm-hmm. Johnny Speed and Chrome was located in Buena Park, but was kind of known more of as an Orange County shop.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, Buena Park is Orange County. It's technically Buena Park is the central of Southern California.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the center point.
Right. But whereas Orange County had Pierside VW, which was they just closed down, I think, last year.
Oh, wow.
And they were there since the 70s. But now you go into LA County and you'd have, like, for example, J-Bugs, which was my everyday hangout.
To the point of getting kind of kicked
told
out from what
I've
heard.
Yeah, right.
Well, and J-Bugs is their parts is still around.
Right.
That company evolved into TMI Products, which makes interior parts for trucks, muscle cars, everything. Obviously, still Volkswagens.
Right.
But yeah, that was like, we went back to that home built kind of thing.
Yeah.
TMI or J-Bugs at the time was a home built, family operation.
Absolutely. 4 brothers.
Yeah. The Tuccinardi brothers.
Right. My first job was I worked at a Volkswagen shop in 1986. And engine compartment, Gene, one of the brothers, he was the driver for them, and he would drop off tune-up parts to different locations. Brakes, tune-ups, all that kind of stuff. And they built one car together. That's the big thing. That was the turning point for them. They built a convertible together. And that's what kind of kicked off the whole thing for them. And look at them, 40 years now later, they're still manufacturing Volkswagen material or interiors.
Parts,
yeah.
No, and they started actually manufacturing those door panels and headliners, all that stuff in their garage.
Right.
So there was a need for reproduction parts and even custom, parts, and they honed in on the interior part of it, because like there were a lot of speed shops that were doing, the engine stuff, or like MP doing the wheels, but not a lot of places, you had like So Fine.
Yeah.
But like not a lot of places were doing the interior part. So that's exactly kind of where they honed in on it.
Right. And that was smart for them to do that too, because there were multiple places. Scat, which I know a lot of LS guys now, they hear the name Scat Rods. Yeah. Okay. Tom Lieb, Volkswagen guy. And actually didn't even make V8 parts until the late 80s. So he was a Volkswagen only guy for a long, long time. And he supplied guys like Parts House, guy Tiny over there in Inglewood that's by Randy's Donuts. They were kind of like, that was like one of the first speed shops that were around that were specific for that, Volkswagen speed. Engel Cams, old man Engel, that was known for land speed records. He made his most of his money making Volkswagen cams out of Santa Monica. So, and there's still Engel Cams are still, even though he's gone, Engel Cams actually, there's a place called SoCal Imports that still picked up all of those camshaft grinds, and they still grind cams to this day. Yeah. So it's, if you want to build a Volkswagen right now, it's a good time.
No, and that's really there's still a lot of the original customizing, parts and companies are out there.
Right.
And what we've seen a lot of, I mean, you got a lot of the clubs like German Volks and a lot of those guys where it's definitely that lowrider influence, but also blending a little bit of some of the performance style of it. And and that's the thing too. You can. We talked about it being such a versatile platform to customize. Still, even to this day, you'll see everything from Baja bugs, off road, buggies to lowrider custom style. I mean, we were just pulling up some photos of like one that Burnt Carlson had done that was just like gull wing
doors, wide body,
double headlight, custom.
Yeah.
Airbrush paint job, like kind of van style, if you will.
Right. Well, because Volkswagens, they are pop culture. You look at the 60s when they would do, the how many people can you fit into a Volkswagen?
Yeah, you look kind of that joke of the clown car and stuff like that.
You look at the Herbie movies from the 60s that Disney did, through 60s and 70s, and then once again with Lindsay Lohan, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, they're an iconic part of Americana that's not even designed here.
No, I mean, were they ever built here?
No. So
I mean, obviously
Brazil,
Brazil had so they had a big.
We'll go back to the years. So 68 to 72 is still considered a German car. even though there's a few changes that people don't really like, but they're still German cars. By 72, 73, when they went over to the Super Beetle, that's a Brazilian car.
Yeah.
And that was when they moved to Brazil and did all of their, up until 1987 is, I think, is the last year that they actually manufactured the Super Beetle.
Yeah. So, until the retro boomer comeback in the 2000s. But that era of the Bug Beetle, I think they just called it the Beetle.
They did.
Not Type 1 or anything, just Volkswagen Beetle.
Volkswagen Beetle, right.
That didn't appeal, I don't think, to any real customized or drag race guys. I don't think it appealed towards the Volkswagen pop culture, because I remember even they had a fake flower vase on the dash.
Right.
So it appealed towards that. I guess you could say the more hippie.
It was supposed to be that retro throwback.
Yeah.
And think of that time when the Beetle came out, when the water cooled Beetle came out.
Yeah.
You had your PT Cruisers, you had your HHRs,
Prowler.
So that was kind of
05 Mustang. That was kind of the retro inspired. Yeah.
Which was smart for Volkswagen because it brought Volkswagen back. For a while at that time before the Beetle,
it was kind of the Golf or the.
Well, the Golfs were fast, but mainly you have the Jetta, which was the girl's car.
But the
Beetle became the girl's car.
The Beetle did become kind of the girl's car, if you will, and that part of it. But still to this day, people have been customizing the classic, Type 1, Volkswagen Beetle.
Right. They are the happy car, though. They're the car that, if you're not even a car guy, someone will walk up to you and say, nice car.
What is pretty cool, especially with researching a lot of this, because, you grew up in some of the era, you were involved in that. I've never really been, but I've always thought that they were cool. And so seeing some of the names of the people that were like key historians, if you will, of it. We mentioned that Carmen Gia from Dukes. There's another guy, Robert Velis, that got that car later on in the 80s, redid it, repainted it, but he's known as the VW Kid.
Yeah.
And he was heavily involved in a lot of that. And you also had a guy, Rich Kimball, who was the editor of Hot VW magazine. And kind of like where we came from with trucking and street trucks, there was a Hot VWs and a VW Trends. There was some competition between the two magazines and the styles that they kind of covered.
And Hot VW, Dune buggies and Hot VWs debuted in 1967 and was
right at that same era of the bug-in, of MP starting, like that, and the growth era.
And Rich wasn't the original editor, but Rich became the editor, I want to say 74-ish. Because he actually wrote the article that coined the phrase,
and that's
cow look.
Yeah, we talked 1975. Right. That magazine kind of coined that term. Yeah.
And Rich kind of kept the magazine on the same trajectory for probably the next 20 years.
So that drag racing and that cow look kind of style.
VW Trends comes out, and like you mentioned, there was kind of an Orange County, LA County kind of deal, even though Hot VWs was located in Orange County, but they were more kind of geared towards the LA County guys and drag racing. VW Trends came out, and when VW Trends came out, it was about graphics, paint,
the street stuff of the 80s. So
the stuff that we saw on Hollywood Boulevard, the stuff that we saw cruising Whittier.
Same thing you would see on the mini trucks and customs of the era.
So it just depended. And Volkswagens, again, they were cheap and easy cars, so that's why guys would put like scallops on them or a bunch of flames or bright color.
Well, they're small, so you don't have to do
and they already ton of paintwork. And they already came in like cool colors, like factory, like Robin's Egg blue is a cool color, or you can paint it Porsche Riviera blue over a that, and that would look cool.
Yeah,
or like raspberry. Why would you paint anything raspberry?
Well, and talking about some of the show cars, I mean, there was a pretty iconic.
Again, you're going back to like RG Canning shows.
Yeah.
Where those guys, they would bring a display. They would make that display look like it was $1 million.
You're talking about the RG Canning shows. I mean, full, mirrors on the bottom, pulling the wheels off. So, I mean,
not just pulling the wheels off,
chrome drum brakes.
Yeah, pulling the brake drums off.
Color matched drum brakes.
Yes.
Yes. So, you compare that to a hot rod of the era, and it's the same. And what's really cool is even, a couple of years ago, Grand National Roadster Show, they have the Slonaker Award, which is kind of the anything but a roadster. Right. America's Most Beautiful Roadster. This is kind of the equivalent, but it could be a truck, it could be a car, it could be a whatever. But there was an amazing You know, the talk of the show, even it didn't win the Sloniker only for like a couple reasons. I mean, and also you had Troy Ladd with Hollywood Hot Rods that just put an amazing, you know, 34 hot rod out there that it was a tough split to kind of go after. But there was a Volkswagen Bug there that was amazing and was the talk of the show for how detailed it was. You know, I think you talked to the guy and saying like how he machined every bolt that was on there and just took it to a whole nother level.
Look, that's Volkswagen guys are a special kind of weird, you know? I mean, they
I think
they get into it.
Insert name of car, Mopar guys are weird.
Well,
you know?
that's the definition.
As we heard Jeff Smith say the other day, he was like, we got Mopar guys.
Right. Whoa.
But that just shows like the history of the Volkswagen, the versatility of it, that it could be street cruiser, you know, even rat rod, you know, kind of rockabilly rat rod, high boy style, to full show car, to, you know, dune buggy, you know, Myers Minx, you know, the Baja Bugs. We didn't even get into that. So, you know, I think this was kind of the defining of what the Cal look was and the Cal style, because those are kind of the two notable, you know, looks of a Volkswagen that we have. But I think maybe in the next one we can get into some of the more offshoots of that, you know, talk about the Baja Bugs, talk about the Volks rods.
And also those dune buggies.
And the dune buggies and kind of what then people started to do with using the Volkswagen as a platform.
Right.